Hi everybody, foXnoMad here, and today I want to help you travel smarter by sharing a recent episode of the foXnoMad podcast with you. My guest is Baab-Muguira, the author of Poe for Your Problems, Uncommon Advice from History's Least Likely Self-Help Guru. We talk all about Edgar Allan Poe's life and his tendency to lie, drink too much, embellish, and why all of these qualities might not be such a bad thing. Thank you again, Kat, for doing the podcast. I came across the book on a Reddit AMA you did, and your responses were so interesting. I was like, I have to read the book. So I got the book from Barnes and Noble, and then I started reading it, and I found it very funny and very interesting. And Poe seemed like this mysterious sort of badass person in my head before, but it seems like he was kind of an elegant mess. So why? I guess I'll start with the first question. Basic question is why? What lessons can we learn from somebody who seemed to have just the most extraordinary life that wasn't always the most well put together? Let's put it that way.
Right. And I think it's a very obvious and understandable question, like, do extraordinary lives have anything to teach the rest of us who may not be living, on that kind of scale? But I do think that's true, that they do. And Poe in particular, because he did so many things wrong. For starters, he drank too much. He torpedoed many of his relationships. He constantly feuded with friends and rivals. He seems to have been unable to hold back some of his competitive instincts sometimes, or if he was in sort of a bad place emotionally, he would absolutely lash out. He did some self-promotional things that a lot of us would question, like he wrote fake letters to the editor, praising his own work that he then published because he was the editor. You could go on and on. I think his criticism can be construed as an early form of internet trolling. He often said extremely mean things about other writers and their work. And, some of his relationships, his personal relationships were quite strange. He married a very young woman who was also his cousin. So anyway, his flaws are legion. I find that so relatable. I didn't marry my cousin when she was 13. And didn't marry a cousin, period, for the record. But it's kind of like that mess piece that you just mentioned. I mean, I'm kind of a mess. I know we're all supposed to be construing ourselves on social media and portraying ourselves as though we have it all together. But I think when we look inside and we're honest and not trying to put a front up, we're all kind of still figuring it out. A lot of us have tendencies to depression and anxiety. I absolutely do. So I find it, in a way, it's a more accessible message than most self-help, because this is a guy who was extremely messed up himself. And yet he succeeded on this scale that is utterly spectacular, and in part because of his flaws. For instance, because he pissed off so many people during his lifetime. That's part of what made him famous at his death, because the knives came out and these people who hated him then started publishing, articles about how much they hated him and what a bad guy they thought he was. And bad press, then as now, is a really good form of PR, or can be. So even the fact that worked counterintuitively in his favor just makes me like him more and makes me feel like he might have something to teach us, and it would be utterly unconventional. And in a way, those would be the most useful strategies, because they're the ones you're not finding in listicles on BuzzFeed or in any typical self-help that's already at the bookstore.
Yeah, and I think it's almost inspiring, because you get into his childhood and his sort of upbringing, and it's tragic. I mean, it really is just tragic. What a difficult life. And for him to have been so successful after the fact, sort of, I mean, he's one of the world's most well-known writers. But from that upbringing to be able to have any success in life, I think is just almost inspirational, even if it took a lot of turns to sort of get there. I mean, how do you think that, I mean, it clearly played a big part into who he was. But how do you think that affected his relationships with all the people around him?
I think it did profoundly, is the short answer. Yeah, his life was utterly tragic. And one of the initial ways I think Poe can offer us comfort is the fact that no matter where you are or what you're suffering, it's likely that his life was worse. Not just because he was living before modern medicine and therapy and Zoloft, but also because his life was a string of losses. For instance, so his mother died probably in front of him when he was not yet 3 years old. And for a child that age, there's no more important relationship than you have with your mother. It's literal survival to you. And this is also a moment where you're not really able to articulate your feelings. Like child development specialists say that this is a moment where your ability, your cognition runs well ahead of your ability to articulate. So that's a particularly horrible moment for a little child to lose such an important person in their life because they're not even able to say the depth of their grief. That Poe became a writer obsessed with articulating grief. He said that mournful and never-ending remembrance was his great theme. I think it grew directly out of this tragedy in his life. And the reason that interests me so much is because with your typical self-help, you often hear, it's usually like some string of like, oh, my motivation was entirely healthy. I was a paragon of emotional health before I started on my hero's journey. I don't really think that's true for most. I know from my own childhood that some of my motivations to succeed and achieve now, however they may manifest, they come out of the fact that I was a middle child in a big family and I wanted people to listen to me. That's probably why I'm a writer now. So Poe's a good example of someone whose motivation was in some ways like very, very dark. And yet he used it to create something absolutely beautiful. I mean, his work is beloved around the world and has been translated into every language. People love it in Thai. They love it. He's a huge figure in Romanian literature and in French literature. And this message of grief and processing it somehow through art has found an audience in the tens of millions now, almost 200 years after he died, which is incredible.
Yeah, and he sort of fits into the theme of there behind a lot of art. There's pain, right? And I think
Yeah.
he definitely personifies that. How do we take that without having to go through such tragedy? Hopefully, to take that as a lesson to kind of push ourselves forward. I mean, how do you think? How did you take that from Poe's life?
I say to myself on the regular, don't question your inputs in a sense of you don't necessarily have to have pure motivation or motivation that strikes you as utterly moral and ethical and something presentable to the world. It matters more what you do with your feelings. Say a lot of us, especially in the age of social media, we are motivated by competing with other people or feeling less than somehow or feeling behind. Those are understandable feelings, right? It's not necessarily what you want to lead with, but if it's part of what's fueling your desire to achieve and succeed or just sort your stuff out, that can work. So I say judge yourself less. In a sense, I'm not advocating people acting unethically or hurting anyone. I just mean maybe lean into a kind of radical acceptance of yourself and your shit, as it were.
And there's almost like a crossroad, right? Like you can take a situation or a part of yourself or something that happened to you and it can go negative. I mean, it can turn into all kinds of things, which it did for Poe: addiction, drinking, all that stuff. Or you can turn it into a positive, or you can kind of do both, which it seems like he did. Do you think he was ever able to, he had moments where he was able to figure that out, or was it just bouncing back between, positive and negative? And how do we learn?
Yeah, so I think like anyone, he was very much a mixed bag, which is another great example that he gives us that greatness comes in many forms, and one of them is a person with obvious flaws. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your
Oh yeah, no worries. um, so how do you think Poe ever sort of
Oh,
understood how
right.
to go between positive and negative? Like, is there a lesson from that you were able to draw?
Yeah, I was going to say that his level of self-awareness, whether you're looking at it like in the work or in his letters, his personal conduct, it comes and goes. Sometimes he seems aware of his motivations and how he's acting. And then at other points, he seems to be completely unconscious of his psychology, which fair enough. I think that's most of us. And yet, like and the fact that his goals were so high, I think helped matters. He had a very high standard for art that he articulated over and over and over again, a lot of philosophy that he developed himself about what he thinks art is doing and trying to achieve and how to achieve it. So the fact that he fueled it in that direction, I think, is very good. Whether he was always in command of himself, I think he obviously was not. But and again, I think it's kind of an accessible example for that reason. We often portray ourselves now as just paragons, and I think it's utterly untrue. It's unlike our own lived experience, and we end up comparing ourselves to people who seem to have all their stuff figured out when they really don't.
Yeah, I wondered when I was reading the book how Poe would do in the social media age, like what he would think about it. I mean, how would he would I can't even imagine. Do you have any insight? Do you have any thoughts?
Some of his articles read like sad tweet storms where a person is just obviously projecting. And hey, I'm not judging. We've all been there. But for example, he once got into quite a big kind of tangle in Boston. Boston was a city he was kind of obsessed with because it was the home of the literary establishment. He had tried and failed to establish himself there as a young man. And for all these sorts of reasons, it was this tangled up place for him. And he was invited there to give a lecture, and he absolutely bombed the lecture, maybe on purpose, maybe not on purpose. Afterwards, though, when he was writing about this experience, he kept drawing more and more attention to it and claiming that his bad performance had been a hoax and it was all on purpose. And it reads just like a tweet storm of like some politician who's not aware of their own psychology either, something along those lines. So to see the public meltdown, I don't know. I just love him for it.
Yeah, I mean, you make him like when I read the lessons, I'm like, he's a very likable character, even though probably if you knew him in real, personally, it would not be that fun to be his friend, or definitely not business associate, I would say.
Definitely not business. I think he was a very full on personality. A lot of us will have had experiences of those. And no, they're probably not who you want to be married to, not who you want to be partners with. But yeah, I mean, it takes all kinds. Poe shows us that that's not necessarily a barrier to being a tremendous success. In fact, it may be a qualification.
Yeah, and he must have had some charm. There's one sort of anecdote from his life that I found really interesting, which is this relationship he had with his adopted father, and being able to get a loan from him, if I'm remembering correctly. And they had a very difficult relationship, uh, but he was still able to sort of convince him to get a loan, which I think takes a lot of charm, right? It takes
Mm-hmm.
some manipulation there, especially considering their relationship. I mean, I found that to be interesting. It seemed like he understood people when he needed to. Is that right?
I think that's definitely true. His career, personal, professional, offers a lot of examples of attempts at fundraising, whether you're trying to catch money off your adoptive father or you're trying to raise money from investors to start essentially like, a media company. And he could be very persuasive. He was obviously good at writing, good at rhetoric, and he had a great deal of psychological insight, even if he wasn't always able to apply it to his own life and behavior. His work, I think, in some ways, has stood the test of time because of the psychological insight in it. So yeah, I like Poe the Persuader too. Sometimes if you look at his correspondence, especially later in life when he was trying to start his own magazine and sort of like climb to the top of the capitalist heap, they're essentially like VC presentations now, where the numbers are definitely a little bit pumped and all the projections are extremely rosy. But it's cool to see that happening in the 1840s through, handwritten letters.
Yeah, it does fit into sort of our modern time, and I I think now on social media, the way it affects the viewer is it can seem depressing, right? Because you're comparing yourself, like you mentioned, to other people, but you
Mm.
can also kind of see it, especially with celebrities and stuff. You can see like that was fake, that was staged, and so on. I don't think Poe had the benefit of that, so it's almost like he was able to create this persona, which I think is kind of one of the good lessons out of the book is that you can kind of make your own narrative in a way. Why not, right? Like why not write your own story?
There's a lot of power in doing that, and a lot of creative energy I think people can tap into by sort of rewriting your own story, rewriting your own life story, presenting yourself with your best foot forward, maybe your most chutzpah driven foot forward. But this is also, it shows us that this is not new. Just like you say, people have been cultivating images and, sort of doing their own PR around the margins since the beginning of time. And Poe's just one example. Poe scholarship is so fun to dive into because now for 150 years, it's like legions of university professors have been poking through his personal finances and the gap between what he said and what was actually fact at the time. So Poe studies as a field are just marvelously entertaining because of how many sort of untruths, half truths, slight fabrications he put out there, and just untangling them is a great deal of fun, and to watch other people untangle them.
Yeah, and I think that he's a writer kind of makes him more likable in the sense like if he were a politician,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like, he'd probably not be remembered very well. But I think that the result of all that art and especially his sort of tragic, upbringing, his life is just, I mean, you can see it in his work. It's tragic, but there's a likable quality because of we get to see a glimpse of it in his writing. And now it's okay if he made up some numbers, well, more than a few now, right?
Right. There's an admirable pluck and energy in the face of despair, which I find, very, it speaks to me on a very deep level. Because I mean, when I got into this idea and I sort of had the epiphany that Poe was a hero, not just a screw up, I was in a dark place myself. And to start to read about his life and realize how much he survived, how much he accomplished in spite of everything, the quality of the work. It's incredibly inspirational, though we don't necessarily associate that with him. And some of it is just like his ability to keep picking himself up again and again and again. It's really admirable.
Yeah, and I think,
And funny.
yeah, I mean, I was thinking when I was like, somebody should make like a real good movie about. I think there have been movies done about Poe, but like just like one of those Oscar-worthy ones because his life just doesn't. I mean, if you wrote it as a fiction, it would almost not be believable. His life, it's so just outland. I mean, it's just the things that happens to him, and then him as a person is just like seems very unusual to say the least. And I think during the pandemic, a lot of people are sort of looking inward and trying to figure out what have I done? Oh, like is this where I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And I think definitely your book is inspirational in that sense. I definitely Poe's life is like, hey, yeah, like you might not be the next Poe, but like there are things that you can take from that. Like, all right, he had it pretty rough, like maybe things aren't so bad for me, or maybe they are, and I can use them to do something else.
Yeah. And I mean, I relate to that in part because I'm not a writer on Poe's level. I should be so lucky, but it's just not the case. He is a world-class genius. His work has survived 200 years. But that doesn't mean that you can't take cues and lessons from his life about leaning into your own incredibly weird personality and just running with it and not really changing, but imbuing your personality into every tiny bit of your work. You may find that it creates an affinity with other people rather than not. I mean, here we are all these years later, connecting over his strange flaws, the dumb lies he told, the self-puffing that he did. There's a lot of human connection there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, if we do those things, that we're cutting ourselves off from our own sort of path to greatness.
So if Poe were alive, is there something that you would want to ask him, or things that you would want to ask him to further to learn more, from the lessons that you've written about? Or do you feel like that might change things?
I will say that sometimes when you run into, like, what my mom would call a real character, someone with a lot of personality, sometimes it can just be fun to buy that person a lunch or many drinks and let them talk. That's my fantasy with Poe. I would like to just hear his spiel of bullshit that he would deliver on unwitting strangers and just be subject to it. I think it would be hilariously fun. He's obviously a very entertaining person. And even in his work, you notice, like, there's real extremities of satire and beauty as well. And the one doesn't negate the other. They're kind of adding to each other in this strange, very Poe-like mix. I love that in conversation too, where you swing between, like, the depths of absolute crushing depression and grief to some incredibly, funny, dark human truth that you can't do anything but laugh at. So I would hope the experience would be like that.
Yeah, he seems like a fun person to have drinks with. Definitely. Is there a line between the lessons? I mean, you might not want to go completely the Poe route, I suppose. Like if you're talking yourself up, or filling out a job application, are there lines that that you would draw?
Well, all right. So in the book, I talk a little bit about, like, how he faked parts of his resume, or at least wildly exaggerated some of his employment claims. And we live in a Googleable age. So this is not a time when you would want to say things that are falsifiable through simple internet searches, right? That's a bad idea. You still see people doing it. Every couple of years, some CEO will have their head roll because they faked a graduate degree for no discernible reason. So yeah, I say half satirically, half seriously, avoid things that are easily falsifiable. You can focus on soft claims though, because those are a lot harder to disprove and may even be true. Like, you say you're a great communicator, or you're great at thinking on your feet or something, when that's not actually a strength. Well, maybe you can cultivate it if you start saying it about yourself. I don't know.
Yeah, you can say it enough times and you might start to believe it yourself. I think Poe sort of cultivated this cult to personality, and there are all these little mysteries about his life and death, which I find fascinating. And after reading the book, I was like, I wonder, are those things, like his death is so unusual, are we so fascinated with it because of the persona that he created? Or is it, and is it true? Or that I also like, there are parts of it that I'm like, did that actually happen? So, right, he ends up in Baltimore. He's drunk or incoherent, wearing somebody else's clothing. And then, yeah, it's a bizarre story. I don't think we ever really know what happened to him.
It's weirdly of a piece with everything else we know, or think we know. Like, there's acres and acres of myths and half-truths and untruths in Poe biography. It's a very contested field for good reason, because he's been slandered and maligned, and then people have just used bad methods. There were a lot of not so reliable sources who've been quoted over dozens of years now. So there's actual problems in Poe biography itself. But the story we're talking about his death, that's largely established. Like, we know it's impossible to know whether he was drunk or not at the time he was found or immediately before he was found, because the doctors and nurses changed their stories so many times. But he was incoherent, we do know that, and he never recovered consciousness to the point where he could explain what had happened. And it's like out of one of his own stories, it's kind of to get maybe a little too neat about things, it's like his final story, or the final mystery that he gave us, which in a sense I think creates greater impact for the formal ones. Would we still be reading his stories if he had not been found incoherent in a ditch wearing someone else's clothes? I don't know.
Yeah, it reminds me of two, like when Einstein died, right? The I don't know if you know the story, but he said something in German, but the nurse who was tending him at the time, right before he died, didn't speak German, so nobody knows what he said, what his last words were after he had an aneurysm, and so we don't know, and it's one of those mysteries. Like, what did he say? Was it people are like, is it a formula? Was it just something nice? Was it well thought out? It might have just been nonsense too. You never know. And it also reminds me in Steve Jobs' biography, because I see parallels between Poe and Steve Jobs, because very good at cultivating this sort of persona, right? This public persona. And in his biography, when he died, he said, as he was dying, he said, wow, wow. And he said, something like, oh my God, wow, like as if he were seeing something from the beyond. And the biographer says, I don't know how true that story is. His family says, that happened. And I don't even know if he thought about that. He premeditated that, to think about what I would say when I die, which seems very in character with him. I don't think Poe's situation is similar in that he planned that night or what was going to happen, but it does feed into like that mystery, like what happened. And that adds a little, rambling on now, but it adds a little mystery to his own works. It almost has like a spiritual quality to them,
and an impact to the personality, kind of like Jobs, where it's very distinct. You don't have to know Steve Jobs in a sense to know what he was like, because his impact on the world was such. He was able to execute on this grandiose and arguably quite arrogant vision, but also incredibly creative and innovative and beautiful vision. Poe accomplished the same thing under incredibly dire circumstances and against very long odds, to sort of bring himself to bear on the world in the way a lot of us would hope to. You want the world to know you and to care on some level, maybe not on Poe's fame level for some of us, but the fact that he pulled that off shows a sort of like personal integrity and strength of conviction that is really admirable, I think, even if it was probably kind of a nightmare too.
Difficult friend, to say the least, right? So there are a couple of mysteries that I want to talk about before we sort of wrap things up, that I had come across, that I had read about years ago, and I don't know if I have these right. There is a Poe story which seems to parallel the Titanic. Am I correct on that? Do you know anything about that?
He wrote a number of shipwreck stories, but I'm not thinking of any that are about an unsinkable ship. Someone may have had an angle on that I'm not aware of, like some aspect of the Titanic. He wrote about shipwreck again and again. He was almost obsessed with it. And this was kind of a piece with the nautical fiction of his day, but he was also using it as a sort of metaphor, man against the odds and so on.
Interesting. So that seems to me that people take the stories and expand upon them and come up with theories. That all feeds into this mystery around him, this sort of mysteriousness around him. And there's another question about the Poe toaster, which is the someone who had shown up at his grave, leaving cognac in a rose every year up until I think 2009. Which adds to the mystery, because I don't think we ever found out who that person was or why they were doing it. So it seems like that legacy of this sort of otherworldly quality to him,
Yeah, he definitely, the personal myth or the mythos of Poe, I think it has taken on this sort of role in our culture where he's almost like, in a way, like a Santa Claus of his own, where he's this gigantic walking figure that in a sense we're all familiar with, and he has meaning to us. And yet, how much is invention? How much is real? And that whole phenomenon fascinates me, because I wonder, like, what are we getting from the story? Like, if we're looking at Poe's life almost like a fairy tale that we tell ourselves, like, what's the message in it? And I think where I landed with this question after 5 years turning it over in my mind was, I think that consciously or not, what Poe communicates to us is how it's possible to achieve these outsized creative visions, no matter what has happened to you, to sort of persevere in the face of the absolute worst circumstances. So I think that's kind of like why he continues to fascinate us, not just because he's like an obvious uber goth and had an interesting personal style, which he totally did. I think there's a message to his life that we don't necessarily like spell out, even when we talk about him. The French did. Poe's reputation in France, which started pretty much with his death, they've always regarded him as a hero. And I think it's because the French are a lot less judgy about someone drinking too much or having a gambling problem or something like that. They're a little bit less concerned with pure saints than we are. And I think in the US, we have a similar take. We just kind of don't say it out loud.
Yeah, I think there is this romantic quality to him. There's this very everybody, I don't know everybody, but I can say, being the drunk writer in the 1800s at a bar, like that to me sounds like a beautiful existence, even though it's probably not as, great as it sounds, but it just sounds like something that might be fun.
Yeah, like an almost kind of like a mythic, frontiersy sort of romance to it. I don't know. I dig it too. It's why I'm so attracted to him, like his story and his work and the rest of it. I think it speaks to all of us who are really into Poe.
Yeah, and so I guess just wrapping things up, is there something that you sort of, after having written all the lessons and gone through Poe's life, is there something that you felt that changed in your perception of him, or maybe a takeaway that you felt was different than when you first started?
Yeah, I had this hunch, this intuition from the material fairly soon after getting into him as an adult. I was like, wow, he's a heroic figure. He managed to persevere no matter what, and it's inspiring me in that. But I will say that feeling only deepened. It wasn't that I checked it against the facts on an extremely granular level and it turned out not to be true. It actually got truer. The further I went down this rabbit hole, the more inspiring he became to me. The funnier he became, the more brilliant he became. There's an endlessness to him that ends up almost being, you look at Poe's life and you see all of our lives. You look at his personality, you see all of our personalities. You look at his artistic journey, you see your own. So I guess I would just say that I think Poe is a far more rewarding and inspiring writer than many of us realize. And if you're going through a dark moment in your life, or you're a little bit stalled, or you feel behind, like you don't know what you're doing, he's a great person to spend time with. And you can do that a number of different ways. Obviously, like my book is at Barnes and Noble and everywhere else, but there are so many, I mean, literally all his work is public domain. You can just Google it. There are innumerable YouTube videos. I write a free newsletter about his life too. So, I mean, there's just, you can dig in absolutely anywhere, and a ton of it is free and like at your fingertips. So consider trying that on your your next self-help kick.
I didn't know about the newsletter. I'll definitely link to that and subscribe, because yeah, I found it fascinating. I did see a one-man play at a Star Trek convention of all places by Jeffrey Combs.
Yeah.
And he does it's Poe. It's all Poe. I forget the name of it, but it was really fascinating. I think it's loosely based on him writing The Raven or something like that. But it was really fascinating because you kind of get to see a personification of him on stage, and it was just, I was like, that's yeah. So he's a fascinating character. I think the lessons are great, and I took away that maybe we should lean into some of those things that we think of as flaws.
I agree. I would just add too, in terms of free resources, that there are innumerable Poe fan groups on Facebook, public and private, huge ones with 4 million people in them, and then smaller groups with like 10,000 people who are just constantly discussing Poe's work. And it can be really fun to join and sit in. There's so much Poe fan art. People get Poe tattoos, they get married at Poe museums. So the phenomenon is ongoing. And if you want to participate, Facebook's a good way for that.
Cool. And just one last thing, it made me think when I was reading all of this, is like a Poe like space travel plan seems interesting. Is there a good one out there, or something?
This blogger actually, so he wrote a blog about visiting Poe sites, and then it was published as a book. It's called Poeland, and the writer is J.W. Ocker. I read it as research for my book, and he's written a number since, and it's pretty wide ranging. Like he goes to Lovecraft's house in Providence as sort of like, because Poe inspired Lovecraft. But also, if you get into Poe travel, I've been to the 4 museums on the East Coast. It's really fun. I mean, it's a little dark and macabre. For instance, if you go to the house in the Bronx where Poe once lived, there's the room where his wife died. And, so not all of it is cheerful in a sense, but it's fascinating. And yeah, there are museums up and down the East Coast. There are so many Poe themed bars and restaurants. And there are 3 or 4 here in Richmond, which makes sense because it's kind of his hometown. There are a number in Baltimore. There are some in Charleston, South Carolina, and I think as far away as Tennessee, which doesn't have a Poe claim that I'm aware of. So that part's fun too. Like if you like food and drink, then there's an angle.
Cool. I will definitely look into it. I'm right now in right outside of DC. I'm in Northern Virginia, so all of those places are very accessible. So it will be great to see some of those places.
Absolutely. I mean, hey, if I'll email you Poe recommendations around Richmond if you want them.
Cool. Yeah, I would love that. That would be great. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and talk more about Poe. Like I said, I really enjoyed the book. I found it really funny and interesting, and it was really, I like the way you wrote it as well. The style was very engaging and different, and it gives people, I think, hope. It's like, hey, I mean, he had a pretty messed up life, and it's like hard work is the element, I feel like, that is kind of a quality of people that you don't need to be rich or poor. Like you can kind of have that sort of motivation, I think, or that, that you can put in the work to something, even if it's, writing fake letters to your editor or whatever.
A relentless commitment to mythologizing yourself. It can work.
Hey, you never know.
On whatever scale. So yeah, thank you for the kind words. I truly appreciate it.
Thanks for watching this episode of the foXnoMad podcast. Let me know what you thought down in the comments below. And while you're down there, hit the like and subscribe buttons. I'll have new videos for you every week, and I'll see you in the next video.